Well, hello, friends. This is Between Two Sundays, and you are with Mark G and Mark B. Hello, Mark B.
G'day, mate. How are you?
Very well, thank you.
Good.
Between Two Sundays, it's Wednesday, and we literally sit between two Sundays and talk about the readings that have gone and the readings that are coming. And we have been doing this now this is the 6th week, man. And
Wow.
I'm having a blast. We're having some awesome, I know I'm having fun talking about the stuff and chewing on them together. Yeah, a couple of weeks ago, had a guy drop in on one of our Instagram posts, Mike Service. Hello, Mike, if you're listening in. And, had a great, I said to Mike when he was saying how much he was enjoying the podcast, I said, look, if it was just for you and me, I'd keep doing it anyway, because I'm just getting so much out of our conversations. So for those of you who have not listened in before, or for those of you who have, and just for the reminder jog, Between Two Sundays, we always start by talking about the readings that have come from the Sunday previous, and we then spend the second half of the show discussing and starting to move and contemplate into the readings for the Sunday that are to come. And last week was the first Sunday after Christmas, and it was really interesting, I think, to have a look at those readings literally the day after we celebrated Christmas Day on the Saturday, and to contemplate what they might mean in that context. I mean, quite often when we celebrate Christmas, it's not always a Sunday. So to be that close to Sunday and to have the readings from the Saturday, but have the readings of the Sunday come straight after, for me was incredibly interesting. And I got a lot out of contemplating them in that context. And I know that, for me, it was pretty much about a grounding, but the thing that stuck with me since Sunday, as I've lived out of it, is the question about Jesus not being where we always expect Jesus to be. That part in that gospel reading where Jesus goes missing and Mary and Joseph have to go hunting for him. And they find him in the temple, and he says, well, what did you expect? This is where I was going to be all the time. And I was really reflecting on that for the last couple of days, and really reflecting on the idea that quite often I'm looking around for Jesus and I'm not seeing Jesus where I think Jesus should be. But the question isn't so much, is Jesus where Jesus should be? Is Jesus where Jesus is meant to be in that moment? And to not lay out an expectation of, well, this is what's happening, Jesus, and you should be right here because that's what I want, as opposed to looking around and saying, Jesus is here. The Christ is present right now in this situation somewhere. Where can I see God moving in this moment? And not to simply say God is here or God isn't here. There's always an expectation that God is present. And in the times when we can't see God, the question is, well, okay, not where I expected God to be, where is God instead? So that's the thing that's really stuck with me as I've been living this out in the last couple of days. And it's really forced me to think carefully and to look carefully and to be a lot more discerning and a lot more mindful of where God is in the midst of the things that are going on as they're going on. And I think I'm going to be dwelling on that one for some time in that context.
Oh, I like that, Mark. I really like the way you've sat with that and played with it. That's just wonderful to think that those really important things have come through in that kind of way. I've been sitting with growth.
Yeah.
This incredible idea that Jesus is perfect and learning, that Jesus is perfect and growing, and the wonderful invitation I think that is for us to give ourselves that same permission, and not only give that permission to myself, but give that permission to those around me. You know, I've what if I was to give that permission to my son and my daughters? That growth is good. We're on a journey here. You are wonderful where you are. And you know, I reckon over the years, I have changed so much in my faith that that when I bring this kind of concept to it, I experience the grace of God now and now and now and now. So when I was 17 and fairly fundamentalist and probably a difficult person to live with, or a difficult person to discuss God with, you know, that was part of the journey. And this idea of Jesus growing actually allows me to look at myself and say, God was patient with me then, God was helping me grow then, and hopefully then to take the next step, perhaps a small step, and say, God is with you, growing you now, even if you're, you know, even if you're not the same as me, that's okay. God's got us on a journey. Jesus came and journeyed through life. I think that's fantastic. That Jesus grew and learnt and discovered is so wonderful, wonderfully human. And I'm just wondering, you know, over the last little while thinking about this, how experiencing that for myself and accepting that for myself can actually be a way of me, it can actually empower me to be gracious to others in their learning, even when, and less judgmental and more patient, and all of those important things that ironically foster growth. Those important things that actually nurture this this journey people go on. I've been thinking partly about that because I will probably be a part next year of a little project called the Gateway Project, which is working with up-and-coming youth leaders and training them as Certificate 3 and 4. So fairly simple kind of level. And I've been asking myself, what is a 50-year-old doing trying to teach people about youth? And maybe what I can bring to that is actually a patience in their learning as they move from perhaps not automatically, but perhaps being fairly black and white in their thinking. What does it look like for me as one who's a little bit older and a little bit more experienced to sit patiently beside them as they think through what it looks like to follow Jesus in this time and in their lives and in the lives of those they want to lead. Because, you know, the temptation is to say, well, you know, what would I know about youth culture anymore? It's not my culture, that particular subculture, but maybe there's an opportunity to allow this kind of discussion to impact my patience with them and celebrate the grace of the God who led me from, you know, from that place to the place I am now and continues to lead me on. So it's not like I've arrived. But if I celebrate that in myself, I think that gives me permission to celebrate it in others, even if they're in a different space.
Isn't it interesting how when we give others the scope to do that, you know, and thinking about loving our neighbor as ourselves, I mean, wouldn't we want someone to have patience with us, right?
Absolutely.
And so then to show the same patience that comes out of that, well, Jesus had to grow. Everybody has to grow.
Yeah.
But I think something you touched on there that was really interesting was that when I give other people the patience and the scope to grow, I'm actually growing in that process some more.
Yes. Magnificent.
You know,
So there's
there's always this growing.
Yes.
It never stops.
Yeah.
We never stop learning. And the very act of giving somebody else the opportunity to enter into that,
Yeah.
you know, it happens the other way as well.
Yeah. Yeah. Sorry, I think I've got a phone going off in the background. Let me
No,
see
that's
what I
okay.
can do.
No, that's fine. All right. So,
I hope that helps.
so before
all this stuff to me really, and I think I'm still learning this, and probably always will learn this. It speaks to me of grace not just being a good idea, but actually being something that works, that can be lived out. And I think there are moments where our goals become short term, and we behave as though grace doesn't work, because we want a short term outcome. We want to fix a situation right now. We don't have time, or don't feel we have time, to allow grace to do its slow work. But this story of Jesus growing just reminds me that grace is a wonderful, wonderful work that even found its place in the Messiah.
And let's face it, we have this gap now from the age of 12 to the age of 30 or thereabouts.
Yes.
And of course, that growth continued.
Yeah. I wonder if
this
story kind of invites us, is one of the few stories that invites us to ponder into that space, that from here to 30, that 18-year space where there's virtually silence. I wonder if it invites us to ponder this growth into that silence, that silent space.
And the point that it wasn't a quick fix. It was 18 years, not to mention the 12 that's happened to this point.
Yeah,
so we're talking,
that's right.
That's a long time. A heck of a long time.
One of the beautiful things about Luke, that he tells this particular infant story. The other Gospels don't do this in the same way. But it's a beautiful thought for us to have this story, and another evidence, I think, that Luke has sat next to Mary and got an infant story. Got a story no one else pondered. I mean, who else is thinking this is even significant, that this 12-year-old kid gets lost at Jerusalem? Maybe the people he encountered and heard and asked his questions of, or answered their questions of, maybe they see some significance in him from here. But really, Matthew, Mark, and John don't tell us any stories like this.
Yes. Wow. We really did a lot out of last week's conversation, or last Sunday's conversation.
Well, when you got great stories like this, it's easy to play off them.
Yeah, for sure. For sure. All right. So this week we're moving into the second Sunday after Christmas. And the readings are Jeremiah chapter 31, verses 7 to 14. Psalm 147, which is a continuation of last week, which was the first half of Psalm 147. This is the second half of Psalm 147, verses 12 to 20. Ephesians 1, verses 3 to 14. And then my favorite, John 1, verses 1 through 18. And depending on your congregation, they may cut out, I think, verse 2 to 9 or something like that is optional. But I really hope that most churches will take the time to really read that prologue to the gospel, even though it looks like it was a later edition, but that's all right.
It's an extraordinary prologue. There was one Christmas at a church I was leading that I used this as my Christmas story, and insist that this was an incarnational story, a telling of the coming of God into the world. it does it a little bit differently. There are no wise men, no shepherds, and no angels either. There's all
John
all
1,
the elements.
kids, do the nativity with this.
All the elements are missing in a sense, but in another sense, it's bigger.
Yes,
it's
so much.
It's so much bigger. It's just starting earlier. It's starting back at creation. But I suspect you wanted to go from Jeremiah through to John, and I've taken you straight to John. So my sincerest apologies.
Not at all. We can go any way we like. I just like John's gospel. The mystic in me thinks that this is the be all and end all. So, but that's cool. But I mean, we don't have to go in order. What else is jumping out for you, or is this the part that really caught your attention?
Oh, look, that prologue always catches my attention. The thought that God dwells among us, John's wonderful articulation of Jesus coming and tabernacling among us, dwelling among us, all the Old Testament echoes of the implications of that. I can never go past what I think here is, I know this might sound strange, but I think it's a dare to read on. I think John is kind of throwing all his cards on the table here a little bit, throwing out an audacious claim. And that is the combination of two things: that God has come among us and that God has been discovered as being full of grace and truth, and bringing grace upon grace. I have a suspicion, and I don't know if I've read this or where I've got this from, but as I've pondered the first chapter of John, I've often thought, here is, how do I put this? Here is a claim that would have sounded absurd. That a lot of people at the thought that the word that created everything has come into the world would have been a terrifying idea. That this would have been, the expectation would have been, if God behaved this way and came into the world, we're doomed. That would have been the expectation. And I often wonder if John is throwing out the idea that that we discovered grace and truth and grace upon grace in this word of God incarnate amongst us is kind of a dare to read on, because people would have been shocked by that. What do you mean God has come into the world and been gracious? Surely if God comes into the world, God is going, we're all doomed. Or God is going to strike all our enemies and we're going to be free. That's the kind of image or expectation people would have had at the thought that God comes into the world.
Yeah.
But here this one comes in, as our Christmas story tells us, humbly as a small child, growing, over time, growing in grace, and these people, or John and his friends around him, discover that God is not here to vent his wrath, but actually here to express the surprisingly humble, gracious, sacrificial heart of God that somehow the world missed.
Yeah.
So I think this is a wonderful, wonderful opening to, and it must draw people in and say, well, I better read this. How come they've come to such a different conclusion of God than I have, or a different expectation of the behaviour of God than I have? And I wonder if this is John very deliberately drawing people into the story and saying, I know this sounds crazy and it's everything you didn't expect, but come with me on this journey because you will discover that God is both present and gracious.
Yeah. Remembering, of course, that that word, that logos, is not a term that John pulled out of nowhere.
Yes.
I mean, this is something that came out of Philo, an ancient understanding of what I guess Paul Tillich would have called the ground of all being, that there's this essence, this energy, this power that's inherent in everything in the universe. And that power decided to become incarnate in a human being to show us what we've missed and how to live.
Yes.
And it's an incredibly powerful, like you said, it's a picture of who God is, but it's also a picture of how we're meant to be. When we are connected to the divine in the way that we are meant to be connected to the divine, when we are truly living into the image of God that is in every single one of us. I might have been here, I talked about a couple of weeks ago, but I think Pelagius was right and Augustine got it completely wrong. We are made good. And there's a seed of goodness that's inherent in all of us. And we need to rediscover that image of God imprint that's in us, because that allows us to live. And how do we do that? Well, God models it by literally taking on the flesh in the person of Jesus. The Christ becomes flesh, which in and of itself is an interesting one too, that, if the flesh is so evil, why would God take on flesh?
It is an extraordinary claim around flesh for Christians who've kind of behaved as though flesh is evil, as though these muscles and sinews and this body is evil, and one day we will shed it and be free. Our fundamental story opposes that idea. And I know, I'm one who acknowledges that Paul tends to, set against one another flesh and spirit. But he's really, I'm quite convinced he's really talking ego there. He's really talking that sense of I instead of God, much more than he's talking muscles and skin and bone. You just can't talk about a holy God that takes on flesh that is evil. That can't sit well with us.
You picked up on something too from the gospel reading that stood out for me, and that's in verse 17. We know in the beginning was the Word, and the Word with God, and the Word was God, and the Word became flesh and dwelt among us, verse 1 and verse 14. But we don't often read a bit further. So after verse 14, we can go over to verse 16. From his fullness we have received grace upon grace, which is what you touched on before. And then verse 17 was the one that really stuck out for me. The law indeed was given through Moses. Grace and truth came through Jesus Christ. And it would be too easy to read that and go, you see, Moses got it wrong, Jesus got it right, or this is old, this is new, this is done away with, this is... No, Jesus said himself that this is the fulfillment of the law. And so it's kind of like this, God gave the law through Moses, and it was kind of like, live this out. And no matter how hard they tried, they couldn't get it right. No matter what they did, no matter how they went about it, they couldn't get it right. And so God, it's almost as if God, a couple of millennia later, goes, look, let me help you out. Let me send the spirit of who I am into a human being and show you how it's done. And I'll get them to teach you how it all works. And so Word becomes flesh. And so I think there's a really important, it's not a duality that, law and grace, or law and grace and truth. I know that, for many years, and having both grown up in that evangelical setting, there's this tendency to put these things against each other. But it's both and. We have law, but we also have grace and truth, which in essence came through someone living the law out as it was meant to be lived out. And what is the cornerstone of that law? Love God, love your neighbor. All the law and the prophets hinges on those two things. And as we were saying before, through that love and acting through it, that's where grace and truth comes into the world. You know, when God, this wrathful God, you know, who's gonna, you know, we haven't kept the law. What is this God gonna do? Love us.
Yes, that's right.
And then straight after that, no one has ever seen God. It is God, the only Son of God, in the flesh, Jesus, who is close to the Father's heart, who has made him known. So in this person of Jesus, the fullness of Christ, the living Spirit of God itself, that was there with God in creation, is showing us who God is. And you know, it's a very subtle thing, but you know, I think there's a reason why Jesus never claimed to be God himself. Jesus never, whenever it was put to him, are you God? He never acknowledged it. And I think there's
He's
a reason.
rather cagey about this, isn't he?
Yeah, and I think it's partly because, in essence, that wasn't where the message was meant to be. I don't think the message is Jesus is God. The message is in us, Jesus or God can also be made incarnate. You know, which is incredibly powerful. You know, talking about the Magnificat a couple of weeks ago, and here's Mary saying, "Yes, God become incarnate through me," and it's the same thing that we're asked to do. And because just like Jesus was able to demonstrate and allow people to see God through the living Spirit working through him, so too we make God incarnate in the world as we live it out also. It's this, I mean, look, you could preach on John 1 till the cows came home, and you still wouldn't have got started. The other thing I picked up in the other readings, just to bring them in quickly, because you know probably should, was this idea of gathering. You know, this idea that you know, this coming of Christ. I mean, and you think about what happened, you know, at least in the nativity stories, and I know we grabbed them all from all the gospels, all the synoptics anyway, and we pull them together. Well, not the synoptics, Mark didn't even talk about it, but you know, Luke and Matthew, and pull them together and create this mega story that we can get kids to act out with tea towels on their heads. But there's something about that story that's interesting, whether you say it all happened at the same time or happened over the period of 2 years, is that the coming of the Christ right from the get-go was about gathering people in. The shepherds were called in, the wise people came, you know, people, you know, there was gatherings that were happening there. And it's interesting that in our readings today, in Jeremiah, it was in verse 10, where, you know, hear the word of the Lord, O nations, and declare in the coastland far away, say, God who scatters Israel will gather him and will keep him as a shepherd a flock. So this God who scatters Israel is going to gather Israel back in together. That while Israel has, for various reasons, run amok and gone astray, and I suspect just for Jeremiah's, you know, he who scatters, I think that's a bit nice. I don't think God scattered them at all. They scattered themselves. But the very fact that they went that way, but that God is going to redeem them together, that there will be a gathering of themselves back together. And likewise in Ephesians 1 and verse 10, but I'll start back at verse 8. With all wisdom and insight, God has made known to us the mystery of their will, according to their good pleasure that was set forth in Christ as a plan for the fullness of time, to gather up all things in God, things in heaven and things on earth. So this birthing of God into the world wasn't just to demonstrate who God was. There was an action that was going to happen through that, and that action was a gathering of redeeming, of bringing in, of reconciling, all these words that you could use there for gather. And all this was going to be an action of that Spirit of Christ in the world that was being lived out through the flesh in the form of Jesus. And that was going to be left behind for us when Jesus left, said, hey, the same Spirit that's in me, it's going to be in you. This same Christ will work through you. And so that gathering, that redeeming, that reconciling continues now through the ministry that we exercise, which essentially is what Ephesians 1 is all about. I remember when, one of the exercises I would give students sometimes in Bible studies would be to go home and read Ephesians 1, 2, and 3 and underline every word that talks about who you are. And as you read through that, I mean, even this first section, we are chosen, we are adopted, we're redeemed, we have love lavished on us. And that's just picking a few out really, really quickly. There's this work that's happening through this presence of Christ coming into the world and God working among us. That's all about this reconciling of us to God, us to ourselves, and us together. And it's a really, really powerful way to think about as we walk on the other side of Christmas now, what that means, what the Christmas story means in the context of that redemption. Often we think of redemption, we think of the cross, we think Easter, that's what that story is about. But the redemption happens in this story as well, this gathering together. And there's
it's really interesting, isn't it? Because none of the gospel writers can bring themselves to just tell us of the death and resurrection of Jesus. They all do it, but that's not the story. That's not the beginning of the story for any of them. So when we call them evangelists, they are people telling the story of the gospel of the good news of God, and none of them are content to just tell you or tell us that Jesus died and rose again. All of them, and I know to varying degrees, tell us that Jesus lived amongst us, died and rose again. And none of them, I think this is remarkable, none of them can bring themselves to start at the death of Jesus. Yet we do that so often.
Well, I mean, look at the creeds. What else are you supposed to do? The creeds say, incarnate of the Holy Spirit and the Virgin Mary became truly human. For our sakes, he was crucified under Pontius Pilate.
Yes.
Hello? Yeah. How did we get from there to there so quickly? What's going on?
If those creeds are the final word, how come the gospel writers got it so wrong? Because they refused to skip the life of Jesus. And these are times when, and I've often wondered, if these writers are evangelists in the sense that they've been spreading the word, spreading these stories for years and years. What if Mark's writing of the gospel really is a collection of what Peter told people about Jesus?
Yeah.
What if it's a collection of his sermons? And if it is, then clearly Peter couldn't bring himself to just tell about the death and resurrection of Jesus. He clearly valued the life of Christ, and that is fantastic. That is wonderful, wonderful news for those of us who are living in the flesh, so to speak. That God could do this too. Hey, I've got a quote that kept coming up for me, especially as you were talking there about this God that scatters and gathers, as our Jeremiah passage, and also I think it links with this idea of law and grace that we often oppose one another. The quote comes from, and it's been playing through my mind for months now, and it's really sat with me and caused me to think quite a lot. It's from Lady Julian of Norwich, who wonderfully said, first the fall, then the recovery, I think is her word. Both are the mercy of God.
Mm,
So we often think of this scattering as something, something that God is not in. And we often think of this law as something that God is not in. But Paul can't bring himself to say that. He says, the law is good. And the law, through the law, I actually realized that I had fallen, so to speak.
yeah.
And God was working in that. First the fall, then the recovery. Both are the mercy of God.
That's good.
And I wonder if this gives us permission to see God working in us at all times, not just when we get it right, but also when we get it wrong. That it's a grace from God when we get it wrong and recognize it and can embrace this wonderful invitation to turn around and live differently. This insistence that we're not stuck.
Yeah.
I just find myself thinking, and what if I took that quote and allowed it to really settle in my heart? How would I treat my son when he gets it wrong? How would I treat my daughters when they get it wrong? How would I respond to my congregation when they get it wrong? What if I'm fundamentally called to express grace even in the fall, rather than express some kind of judgment or pointing of the finger? What if I can experience grace even when I get it wrong? How gracious might that make me? If I was to live it out. I love the thought that maybe even in the scattering, God is at work.
Yeah, absolutely. So much in these readings this week again.
These are special readings.
And I think what's really cool, if I can just get off the topic as we get ready to close, but I sort of summate it like this. What's really interesting, I think, in the last 6 weeks that we've been going, is that when you take the time to chew over these things and be doing this with somebody who you don't have to fear they're going to tell you that you're thinking wrong or theology's whack or you're a heretic, or I get that all the time anyway, but not from you. But how easy it would be. Our conversations aren't anything spectacular or special, and if you're listening in, I have no doubt that if you could find some people or even a person to sit with and have these conversations with in the way that Mark and I are each week, you'll get to these places. You'll discover the richness that's here. You'll find yourself going down rabbit holes and freaking out and big grins on your face and moments. I just think that taking the time, and this is why, to be honest, this is why we found the idea of this podcast so compelling. And all the time we ask the question, why should we do it? Is it that important? We kind of went, yeah, it is. So just an encouragement, if you're listening, find some people that you can have these conversations with. Use the podcast as a launch pad. Have a listen to that first and then come together and chew on that and go your own directions with things and see what comes out of it. And please, if you do get cool stuff out of it, go over to the Instagram page. The handle there is at Between Two Sundays. That's number 2 in the middle, Between Two Sundays. Follow us there. Every day we're posting reflections on different parts of the readings as we head into and then out of the Sunday. And don't forget, at barefootfollower.life, Mark's got the articles there, which, in the space that Mark's able to, and the articles there goes even deeper. So, take my short, pithy little things, or take Mark's long, deep stuff on top of the stuff we talk about here. And something that's probably worth mentioning, I write the posts for the Instagram out of these, after this conversation,
Yeah.
has happened. So the first one, well, no, the first one went out this morning, but that's just a general wrap. And if you read that first thing, you're going to get a bit of an understanding of where I'm going when I share my bit here. But each day, it's as it comes out. Mark's articles are written. We write this stuff separate to one another. We don't sit down and plan what Mark's going to write in the articles or what I'm going to put in the posts.
Yeah.
It just happens. So, there's thoughts there and ideas there that probably didn't appear here as well for both of us. So chew on those as well and use them with other people and keep these conversations going. And like I was going to say, over at Instagram, jump into the DMs or the comments on the posts as they come up each day and have conversation there with us. We really do want to interact with you. And to those people who've started doing that, thank you so much for your thoughts and reflections and your kind comments and the direct messages as well. It's a real joy for us to hear that. Yeah, thank you. Before we go, tell us about your backdrop.
So this is a painting by one of my favourite Australian Indigenous artists, Safina Stewart. I've just plucked this off her website because I needed a cooler background than the one I've got behind me. But what I love about this is it's the story it's telling the story in Indigenous language of the spread of the gospel, of the spread of this wonderful story that we celebrate each time we gather around these scriptures. So that's Jesus there in the centre, and then those U's are representative of people, and so you've got the big human in the middle, and then you've got what's representative of the apostles around it. But then you've got these song lines going out into the world, and they're all a little bit, they're heading in different directions, but they're reaching out and impacting the earth around them. So all those rocks there, symbolic of the rocks, symbolic of the earth. I really enjoy Safina Stewart's stuff. One of my favourite paintings of all time is her depiction of the 7 days of creation in Indigenous sort of symbols as well. But I've become a really big fan of this one as well. So
that's beautiful.
Safina Stewart, she's awesome.
Awesome. Thanks, man. And thank you, Safina Stewart. And is there a website people can go to if they're keen to have a look at more?
Yes. And the way I would get to it is Google Safina Stewart.
Yeah. How do you spell Safina?
I can't tell you exactly what it is.
Okay. No, that's all right.
But thanks for putting me on the spot there. I appreciate that.
No, that's fine. No problem at all. But do go and check out Safina's work. There's some beautiful Indigenous artists out there depicting some of the stories of scripture, and it's incredibly powerful. And for us here in Australia, incredibly important that we understand our First Nations culture like that. Well, that's it, my friends. Thank you so much for listening in between two Sundays. As we said, jump over to the blog, barefootfollower.life, jump over on the Instagram handle at Between Two Sundays. Follow us in those places, leave your comments and direct messages and so on. We really do want to interact with you. And thank you so much for listening, and please have those conversations and let us know how those conversations go for you as well. And that's it, my friend. Until next week.
Thank you, Mark. That was fun.
Always is. All right, folks. Well, God bless you. Peace be with you.
Yeah.
And until next week, bye for now.
See you then.